Tady Havel, slyšíte mě? Čím dřív začneme, tím líp. Mohl bych jen maličkost. Pokud budeme držet pohromadě, budeme se mít všichni aspoň trochu rádi, navzájem si naslouchat a jeden druhého chápat, nemůžou proti nám nic. Přeji vám mnoho úspěchů.
So hi everybody and welcome to this edition of In Conversation With at the Václav Havel Library and on the Havel channel, in which the focus this evening will be on English language journalism in Czechia, where it's at and where it might be going. And we've got a super panel this evening. We have Jan Lapatka, who is the Reuters chief correspondent for the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Rob Cameron, long-term BBC correspondent in Prague, and beside me here, Daisy Sindelar, who is former Vice President and Editor-in-Chief at Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, and co-founder of the rather new Weight of the World podcast. Thank you all for coming, and thank you guys for coming too. I should point out, by the way, that I myself work for Radio Prague International, which is part of Czech Public Radio, but it's funded by the Czech Foreign Ministry. I'd like to begin, if I may, by looking back at the relative glory days of English language media in Prague, by which I mean the 1990s, when there were loads of media outlets here and loads of correspondence and stuff. Rob, could you describe the landscape back in those days when we first lived in Prague?
Certainly. Well, thanks, Ian. Is it on? It is on. Yeah. I can certainly describe the Rigorovy Sady beer garden in Vinohrady, circa 96, 7. I do remember. I didn't say that deliberately. 6, 7. I was sitting. I remember when you invited me to appear on this panel this evening. One thing that did come into my mind was one night at the beer garden, had a big table, maybe 12, 14 people, and going around the table, it was just he's the independence man in Prague. Okay, this guy, he's the Telegraph. Here's Ray, then BBC correspondent, I guess. And it was just an incredible, arrangement of foreign correspondents, and ranging from fully staff correspondents, people who were for whom Prague was an assignment, someone they would be for a year, maybe 2, before moving on somewhere else, right down to people like me, who were people who lived in the city and who worked as journalists for the English language media. And it was really a lot of fun, but it was also indicative, I think, that the Czech Republic was still a place that was interesting in news terms to the international media. And we have tried on several occasions, in fact, I think even with Honza's help, to get a few such people together around a table at Vinohradsky Pivovar, an excellent brewery in the Prague 3, Prague 10, Prague 2. What is that street?
Thanks for the product placement.
Okay. But sometimes we do gather as journalists, as people who work for the English language media, foreign journalists, and let's just say we don't need a very big table anymore. It's certainly not 14, 16 people around a table in the beer garden. So for me, that's what stands out most. There are just fewer of us, and there are certainly far fewer, how can I put it, native English-speaking foreign correspondents who live permanently in Prague. And I believe I may be the only one. I can't think of any others. People who are, no offense, but, not Czech. I am also Czech now, but people who are actually foreign correspondents who now, who still live in Prague, I can't think of any others.
I'm sure there are very few. Also in those days, there were newspapers, right? There were magazines.
Yeah. Yes.
When and why do you think it fizzled out? You kind of already answered the question a little bit, but when did that all come to, or at least start kind of sliding downwards?
2 things happened in 2004. I started my career, if you can call it that, with the BBC as the full-time stringer correspondent for the Czech Republic and Slovakia based in Prague, and the Czechs joined the EU. And at that moment, it was almost an audible sense of this country is no longer so interesting in news terms, especially as Slovakia was still very much in the doldrums in the sort of post-Mečiar era, whereas the Czech Republic was just becoming more and more normal and boring. And that process has, despite everything that, all the things that we as journalists are so thankful for here, Václav Klaus's Euroscepticism, Tomio Okamura, just leave it there, Philip Turek, all these things give us work, but it's just not a very interesting place in news terms.
So there aren't enough freaks anymore.
There aren't enough freaks, or the freaks are in a country which just is interesting for a number of reasons, but it's simply not, you know, it's not Ukraine. It's not even Hungary.
Well, thank goodness for that.
Indeed.
At least. I'd like to also ask you all about how your jobs have changed over the years. Hansa, how long have you been at Reuters? If you could give him... Oh, he's got a mic, sorry.
30 years. It's gonna,
30,
yeah,
wow.
It's going to be 31 in January, actually.
And how has your work changed, and also your workplace in terms of the size of the team and that kind of thing over those years?
Well, it was the boom years when I joined. I actually joined after a brief stint at Radio Metropolis, which I would like to recall. It was an English language FM radio station, the last on the scale, 106.2, where I met my first future colleagues, a bunch of English and American expats, enthusiastic about life in Prague, and some of them journalism as well. And through an acquaintance there, I got into Reuters, who at the time Reuters had 5 correspondents in the Czech Republic and 3 correspondents in Slovakia. And I was the only one who was Czech. All the other ones were native English speakers, English, American, and Canadian person as well. And in Slovakia, we had the head of the office in Slovakia was a Czech national, Johnny Krčmář, who emigrated, and he then worked for Reuters in Austria for many years before coming back. And Reuters has 2 legs. Reuters has the general news leg, but also Reuters was big and still is big in financial journalism. And apart from the general political coverage, which was exciting here in the 90s, it was with privatization and the foundation of the Prague Stock Exchange, it became, and I'm not going to talk about, but this is to the point, it became interesting for our financial clients, foreign exchange trading with the Czech crown, with the Slovak crown, the big privatization deals, a financial crisis in emerging markets in 97, when collapse of the currency. This is something we wrote about a lot. But it also led to the expansion of the office. And we, for many years, had a Czech language service specifically for traders and banks, which grew to at one point to 5 people, 3 reporters and 2 translators. So the office was like 10 journalists for text, and we had a TV person and we had a photographer as well. And we often hired a second photographer. And 3 people in Slovakia. Well, Slovakia actually started shrinking the first, and that was with the adoption of the euro in Slovakia and the end of the Slovak crown as an independent currency in 2009. And then also because of the global financial crisis, which was difficult for the company, for Reuters as such, we started dwindling in numbers, mostly by attrition, and somebody left. The job was cancelled. It was not being replaced. The person was not replaced. And eventually we also shut down the Czech service because we found it was no longer necessary because all the traders have learned English well enough since that they could base their very quick trading decisions without translations. So right now there's 3 of us who write, who cover the Czech Republic and Slovakia, because we have nobody in Slovakia permanently. And we have a photographer, but we often hire a second photographer and a video person. And our photographer does video as well. And we have one person in Slovakia who is not an employee, but he works for us, I would say, 10 days a month, who is a video/pictures person.
And is financial information the thing that keeps the wire services going?
It's about 50-50, but like in the good years when we were less interesting for the front pages, but more interesting for the financial pages, it would be about 80% financial and 20, I'm making this up, but 20% general news. But the world has changed with the great financial, with the great crisis, with the euro debt crisis. Governments had to step in, bail out banks and so on. Greece was in crisis. And then we had obviously COVID and now the war. So our coverage has shifted significantly towards international affairs, diplomacy, security and defense. It just changed a lot. So the financial stuff that we do less financial, more general news these days.
Thank you. Daisy, obviously Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty works in many languages, not just English. Over your years there, how did it change in terms of the newsroom and the work? I know it's a huge question, but...
Thanks, Ian. And I do want to say, too, I really love hearing stories about Prague and the journalism scene in the 1990s. I spent the 1990s in a similar environment, but I was in Moscow. I was working for an English language newspaper there that was very similar in makeup to the Prague Post, called the Moscow Times. But it was the same kind of environment where you turned over any leaf and there was a foreign correspondent there of some stripe. And obviously that has changed entirely and very regrettably, but it is nice to hear those kind of cozy stories about 1990s journalism. So I assume that many of you know the basic structure of Radio Free Europe, which is indeed an enormous organization. It's confusing even to those of us who have worked there for many decades, and it's hard to describe its basic structure, but it really is like a building full of different news organizations. So rather than having one newsroom, we really have about 26. And that is because we're broadcasting to a number of different countries, and each of those countries has fairly broad latitude when it comes to making decisions about the type of news they want to be covering and the way they want to cover it. Some people may emphasize music. That was the case with Iran. Other people want to emphasize video or hard news journalism, and it really depends on what's most needed in that market. So that was a really nice aspect of working at Radio Free Europe, is that it was not a cookie-cutter approach to journalism. Each of these teams had a lot of choices to make. So when I came to Radio Free Europe, it was 2001. And so the very notable thing that happened in those early years was, of course, that we were shedding a lot of the traditional language services that we had had through the Cold War. So with the Czech Republic and other countries entering NATO and the EU, we were dropping service to the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, the Baltic states. And I remember at the time that there was real euphoria on the one hand, that it was mission accomplished, as it were, that we were able to say goodbye to these countries that had successfully moved over to a democratic system of government. But there was also a lot of fear and reluctance among the language services that it was too soon, that we were giving up on some of these countries too quickly. And I remember that in particular, we had real protests from our Romanian team. They proved to be prophetic because we ended up returning to Romania. We also returned to Bulgaria and Hungary, although sadly, we just dropped back out of Hungary in the past few weeks. So I think those are the big changes, the languages we lost. And beyond that, I would just say that over that arc, one thing that I'm particularly proud of and that I think was a great evolution for RFE is that we went from reporting on what I would call the corridors of power, what did the man in the Kremlin say today, to what did the person on the street say today. And if you think about journalism in a post-totalitarian society, that is an incredibly important message for audiences to receive, that it is not necessarily the decision makers who make the news, but the ordinary people, school teachers, council members, et cetera. And so that was not just a great thing to do for our audiences, but it was a really therapeutic type of training to do for our many, many journalists who had worked and grown up in all of these post-Soviet countries.
Now you've got a new venture, this podcast, Weight of the World. What led you to the field of, the rather crowded field of podcasting?
Yeah, well, first of all, I must give credit where credit is due. So Weight of the World, this podcast is actually the brainchild of my podcast co-host and partner who's here in the audience today, Steve Satchoff. He can wave his hand. And about a year ago, we were in the same boat. We're both American. We were feeling perhaps a little at sea and in disbelief that Donald Trump had secured a second term as president. And at the same time, we felt enormously grateful to be not in the United States, but in a part of the world where people understand totalitarian government. They understand what it means to have their personal liberties taken away from them. They know, in many cases, what it means to fight to retrieve it, and they know what it means to hold on to it and how complicated that process can be. And so very often, since Trump's inauguration, you have heard people say about Americans that they do not have the vocabulary to understand what is happening in this political moment as government checks and balances are being destroyed and the institutions, RFE among them, that came up with the Cold War in the wake of World War II are being destroyed virtually overnight. And yet we lived in a place where people very much have the vocabulary, and we were grateful to be able to turn to friends, acquaintances, and other people who were recommended to us to talk about this moment in American politics. They talk about coming up in their own countries, their own experiences, and how that shaped their values and their belief in political democracy, and what they see when they look at the United States. And the advice and the insight that they give us has really been first rate. And I should say, too, that one of our most recent guests is Tomas Sedlacek of the Václav Havel Library. So,
great choice. Rob, what year did you become the BBC correspondent, and how has your work changed over those years?
2004 was when I started, was when I became the permanent BBC correspondent, i.e. the one who was doing it every day. And perhaps 4 years before that, I was basically minding the shop when my predecessor, but one, was out of town, Ray. So when he wasn't here, I was doing the work. So my relationship with the BBC goes back to maybe 1999, but I started working full-time in 2004. And in terms of the way my work has changed, it's changed enormously for a number of reasons. I mean, when I started, for a start, there was a BBC bureau in Prague, and a big one. I mean, it was in Opletalova in ČTK, the Czech news agency building, and they had a pretty big office there with studios, and it belonged to the Czech service of the BBC. And exactly as Daisy mentioned there, talking about RFEs, foreign language services, of course, the BBC still has broadcasting in many languages, and then Czech was one. And then, around 2005, for pretty much the same reasons, the BBC decided these are now, you know, countries with the rule of law, and they're mature democracies. Well, mature, they're teenage democracies, but maturing with free media, and we don't need to be there. And I think also there was, frankly, a financial decision that Blair wanted to start an English language Arab TV service, and he needed money, and so pressure was put on the BBC to fund it, which is why they shut down 10 services in 2005, I think it was, 2006, and the Czech service was one of them. And so in one fell swoop, that office disappeared. So that's for me, if you ask how my job has changed over the years, within a year of starting the job, I was essentially going from an office environment where I would have colleagues and technical support and studios and a studio line to London, and just other journalists, BBC journalists, all of whom were fluent in English and obviously knew everything about this country.
And great journalists, because they went on to great things, many of them
Fantastic
afterwards, right?
journalists, you know, I mean, Václav Moravec and Bob Charp and all these people, Václav Sokor, so many fantastic, great journalists, many of whom went on to Czech Radio and Czech TV. But they were my colleagues, so I sat in this incredible office with them, and I could go to them for guidance. If I needed to have a second pair of eyes on a script, or if I just needed to know a fact, then sitting there is Petr Brod. And Petr Brod, who's the former, he was actually the head of the Czech service of the BBC in this country, and Vít Kolář, I think, was the head in London, or maybe the other way around. But I mean, Petr Brod, as anybody who's ever met him, is a walking encyclopedia of Czech, German, Slovak, Austrian, Nazi, Holocaust-related stories. If you need to know something, you ask Petr. So to have him there was great. But anyway, overnight, I lost all that. And I went from a really well-furnished office with technical support, a studio line to London, and great colleagues, to my living room. Or a desk in my living room. And I had to build everything myself from that. So I had to build a studio, a radio studio, so I could do what I do. I had to get an ISDN line from O2, which was not easy then, but they finally figured what I wanted and why I wanted it, so that my studio could work, so I could talk in quality live to London, not rather than down a phone line. So I had to do that, again at my own expense, because I'm freelance. But most of all, I had to get used to being working from home. So, you know, for many people, obviously for most of the world, COVID was a massive shock. Not for me. I've been sitting in my boxer shorts at my desk for the past 20 years. So I'm completely one-man band now.
And how does the interest on the part of the BBC in Czech news compare today to, say, 15 years ago?
I thought a lot about that because I knew you'd ask me that. I think the problem is two things have happened. Yeah, one, this country has become less interesting, frankly, for good reasons. And when I say interesting, I mean less turbulent, less unstable, less violent, less, not that it ever was, but you know what I mean. And the rest of the world, including countries very close to us, have become more so. So that's what's changed, and it's been a slow process. And I hope for the sake of myself and my kids that it doesn't go the other way, but, you know, in work terms, yeah, okay. It's you know, as the country's become more stable, it's become less interesting and less newsworthy.
I once, or some time ago, I learned a very interesting term from Rob, which was bigfooting. Could you please explain what bigfooting is?
Bigfooting, it's a delightful thing. It's basically when you're the correspondent, or in my case, the stringer, like the freelance correspondent, based somewhere, something happens, and then immediately some very senior correspondents get flown in from London, from Brussels, and so all those live TV and radio hits that you've been doing since the person was shot, the plane crashed, for the previous 12 hours, you no longer do them, and then John Simpson does them. Not John Simpson, but someone.
What you need is quite big news events, not huge news events. I need
quite big news events that are not big enough for someone else to come out and Bigfoot me. But also in these days, you know, you usually have like 12 hours, 24 hours on it before they can get here. And when they do come here, they don't speak Czech, and they don't have the background. And so they often still need you to be a fixer, which I'll gladly do myself.
Well, I'd like to speak more generally now about the threats or possibilities perhaps facing journalism, and particularly AI. Hansa, do you use AI in your work at all?
Reluctantly.
But for what?
Well, Reuters has its own AI in an internal environment. It encourages journalists to use it in a sort of a controlled way. And we have to go through a lot of ethics training about how to use it and so on. But some of my colleagues use it, and I've only tried it. I don't use it on a daily basis, but it does things like bullet points for the top of your story that summarizes the story. It suggests headlines. I've started using it for live transcriptions of news conferences, and that's very useful for that, or for automatic translations. That's very useful, and it's getting very good very quickly. It helps me save a lot of time typing up interviews, for example, and things like that. What I've been toying with also is creating commands for the AI that you save and can use them to summarize news releases. For example, if you tell it what to look for, like look for mergers, acquisitions in this company's annual report or whatever financial release, it does it very well and very quickly. It's scary, but I am a very, as my wife says, BC person. She means before computers. So I'm a slow adopter.
Daisy, do you think AI is something to fear or embrace or both?
Well, it's here, and so I think we have to be pragmatic about it. Obviously, within the field of journalism, AI serves really useful purposes, like Jan was just describing. In investigative reporting, it can be incredibly useful in crunching an enormous amount of data. But those are following human commands. And I think before we totally give in to despair about AI, we should also see it as an opportunity to remind ourselves that journalism is ultimately a human exercise, and it's an opportunity for us as journalists to embrace what is most human about journalism. So I read recently that 2026 is going to be the first year that AI-generated content outpaces human-generated content. That sounds scary on the face of it, and you really have to ask yourself, what kind of value does journalism deliver in a world of infinite content? And I think it's an opportunity to double down on the basic principles of journalism that made it appealing in the first place, which is that journalists or journalism is the promise that someone is actually going out and checking information to make sure that it is true, to make sure that it is relevant, and to make sure that it's responsibly sourced. And so the second half of that equation falls to the audience. They must be discriminating in the content that they're looking at. And I know from personal experience and the experience of everyone around me, that's incredibly hard to do when you have a world of information, you know, a fingertip away. And so I am optimistic that as people become more concerned about issues around them, and I do hope that at some point we'll talk about the potential for resurrecting the local news market here in the Czech Republic, that people will become more demanding and more discriminating when it comes to their news use. Easy to say, harder to do, but I think well worth at least part of the time that we're spending scrolling at the moment. We could be thinking about this problem and how to solve it instead.
And Rob, where are you on AI?
Incredibly skeptical around 6 months ago. Now a daily user and daily, I'm thankful for it. It really is very helpful. But I've gone through all the same processes that Jan and Daisy described, from being wowed by it, and then being incredibly disappointed and angered by it. So you really have to learn how to use it. But I think I'm kind of getting there now. In the beginning, I found it just amazing that, oh wow, I can transcribe this. I don't have to sit through this interview and transcribe it. Not that ChatGPT does that, but there's Pinpoint and these other things. And then I thought, well, if it can do that, then it can write this postcard that I have to write for Irish Radio or Deutsche Welle, and I asked it to do that, and it was okay. And I thought, okay, well, I'm still a better writer than ChatGPT, and so then I started using it for different things. But at the moment that you ask it for facts is obviously where you get into trouble with the hallucinations and so on. And I remember a famous argument I had with it, and it is ridiculous to be admitting this, that I was sitting there arguing with my laptop. But I was writing something about beer. I should have just called Hansa. But I was doing something about Pilsen and where it was brewed. And I asked ChatGPT, is Pilsen, it's also brewed in Poland as well, isn't it? And ChatGPT said, yes, it is. It's brewed in the blah, blah, blah brewery in eastern Poland. I thought so, because I dimly remembered that it was. And then I thought, no, but they stopped brewing it there because the quality wasn't good enough or the water was different. And so I think now Pilsen is only brewed in Pilsen. And so I said that to ChatGPT, and it came back and said, you're absolutely right. Right? So on facts, it's treacherous, with the big caveat that I was sitting with a friend of mine at the weekend who works for a big antivirus company, and he's obviously, a tech guy, coder. But he said, yeah, but do you use the behavioral, I can't even remember what it's called now. Do you tell it how tough to be on you? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, well, just put these commands in. And he copied them to me on WhatsApp. And they're basically, always source. Never say this, never do that, never take this for granted. Always give me this, always give me that. And so now I've put all that in. And it's no longer just blindly patting me on the back and confirming my biases. It's really tough on me now. So everything I write, so I put my text in and I ask it to check it for style, for syntax, and for veracity and the facts. And it does do it, and it picks it apart, and it says, okay, this is true. This, why, this is arguable. And it's scarily useful. It's like having an editor. So I basically now have an editor, whereas before I had a little sort of cheerleader. But I will just say, to conclude, that I'm recently grown a Substack. And so I have to write every week now my Substack. And for that, it is really useful. I'm trying to do this one this week about Babiš and the European Council meeting and the frozen Russian assets and the reparations loan for Ukraine. But I want to make it more about Babiš than about the EU and institutional workings of the European Union. So it is very good at saying, you're getting a bit kind of wonky here. I thought you wanted this to be about Babiš. Each time I write a new paragraph, it comes back and says, yes, but is that really what people will be subscribing to you to do? So used correctly, it is like having an editor sitting next to you. Used wrongly, it's awful and will be the end of human civilization.
Great answer, Rob. Now we have a moment for questions from the audience. If anybody has any questions, there's a microphone at the back, so please wait. If you've got a question here in the third row, please wait a second, please, because it's recorded.
Is your AI as tough as you as your wife?
No, but she's French, so.
You're English.
Yes. No. It's not. No, but I could tell it to be, and then it would be, I guess.
I just came, before someone else asked, I just came across an interesting report in the last week or 2 weeks ago. The volume of traffic to check magazine websites, especially the likes of like motorists' websites and lifestyle magazines, culture magazines, dropped by 40 to 70% this year. Because people get the AI-generated answers to their questions at the top of their Google search, and people no longer click through to the news websites. So it's absolutely killing the income of these websites they get from people clicking in. So we have a huge problem there with the business model. So it's not the first problem with Google, like living off real people's work, but this is an additional layer of the problem there.
So the news sites are basically doing the work for AI, and the news sites are getting nothing for their work in this case.
Well, I would say though, because ChatGPT often tells me, I can't check that link for you. Can you paste the text into it? So they're going to these websites, but I don't think they can extract the text without someone going to the trouble of copying and pasting, putting them in there.
This is just the top of the Google search. If you search for, you know, what do you think of the new Dacia Logan or whatever?
Any other questions? Yes, in the fourth row.
Hi.
Thank you.
I know that your focus is English language journalism, but I just wondered, since we have Daisy here, and it's a topical issue for the moment, if it's possible to say something about what might be the future of Radio Free Europe in Prague. I was really touched about a week ago to meet with a teacher at the international school, so a high school here that like just tons and tons of Radio Free Europe kids have gone to over many, many years. And it made me realize just how big a presence Radio Free Europe has been in Prague, having so many international journalists here, because she said one of the worries of this particular high school is just how enriching it's been to have that many kids of journalists at the school, that it just always meant that there was, you know, a certain percentage of kids from very, very culturally aware families. And it just made me realize what a huge presence RFE has been in Prague and how important it is. And I'm curious if you have any insight, what its future is going to be in Prague and in Europe and the world.
Thank you. That's a good question and emotional for me as well. I should say I have not worked at RFE for 3 years, so I cannot speak with absolute authenticity about what's happening inside the organization at the moment. But what we saw over the last year is that Trump sought to defund U.S. international broadcasting, which includes Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, among other institutions. And despite the fact that RFE had already received a congressionally approved grant for public funds, it had to then claw back that money by going to court on a monthly basis. And the net effect of an action like that is that you cannot be certain of next month's funding. So you are cutting everything you possibly can. And I know that they have reduced broadcasting to a number of essential countries at an absolutely essential time. And they have also scaled back benefits for staff members who are based here in Prague. The biggest casualty, as far as I'm concerned, is that everyone knows that happened. And no one took greater delight in the decimation of the ranks at RFE than the Kremlin, to the point that it actually made it top news in Russia. And the minute that an organization that is dedicated historically to providing a safe haven for journalists from some of the world's most dangerous reporting environments cannot even protect its own journalists from the very administration that's supposed to support it, was simply catnip to Putin and autocrats everywhere. So it comes at a terrible time. I believe that they have secured some funding for at least part of the fiscal year in 2026, which is good news. But that is no way to run a journalistic organization where you are living hand to mouth on a monthly basis with no certainty of what will come next.
Thank you, Daisy. I should also add, by the way, that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty came to Prague because of Václav Havel, right? He's the reason that you guys all came here and had kids here and so on. Another question here in the fourth row, the man in the scarf.
Hello, I was just wondering, you were talking earlier about with Reuters and the BBC, the lack of interest when the Czech Republic became less interesting and things were scaled back. But, you know, you were also talking about the 1990s when many of us remember, it was touched on a little bit about magazines and newspapers were prevalent here, most obviously the Prague Post. And that seemingly was for an audience that was here, not international looking in, but for people who lived here, who worked here, but who, you know, needed day-to-day information about what was happening in the country, both financially, politically, culturally. And of course, that went by the wayside. And so that's not, didn't fail because of the lack of outside interest. It failed, you know, I'm just wondering why you think it failed. What was the reason why we don't have a Prague Post anymore? And I think a lot of us remember that as a very valuable resource on so many different levels.
I think, Grant, it's a combination of the sort of natural, what's the word, decline in the numbers of English speakers here, because in the 90s there were never 100,000 Americans here. That was just a weird headline in some newspaper, wasn't it? It was more like maybe 20 max, maybe 10, I don't know. And then I don't know how many Brits there were, but I mean, the numbers have tailed off a lot. And a lot of the people who are here now are in some ways transient. They'll work for big international companies and be here for 2, 3, 4 years. And for them, there's expats and Radio Prague and so on.
I think they're not interested anyway if they're just here for a few years. I think they just
certainly
live in their own bubbles and they're just not interested in Czech news.
So I think there's fewer people, and I guess just the model as well. I mean, I've just always heard that it wasn't really viable long term. In that Prague Post had that benefactor, Luther
Monroe,
who basically paid for it, bankrolled it. And then there was Prognosis, which tried to compete, but they didn't last that long. I guess it wasn't a sustainable model for advertising.
Well, I think a lot of them also had international supporters, or in America they had supporters. I spoke to somebody who was one of the founders of Prognosis. They borrowed money from their parents, and there was this enthusiasm and wish to do something, and they were young and all that stuff. But I often wonder who's going to pay for anything. Basically, you need a kind of sugar daddy, it seems to me. And say with the Czech media, at least some of the Czech media outlets are owned by oligarchs or very wealthy people. But why would any very wealthy person want to support an English language newspaper or any kind of media? It seems unlikely to me. Why would, there's no reason they would want to. And so there's nobody willing to pay for it. In the case of Radio Prague, it's paid for by the Czech state. Who knows if that will continue? But there's nobody there with the money, or nobody's thinking they're going to make any money out of it. So you need basically a benefactor, it seems to me. And the market is, very small, I think. Any other questions? Yes, near the back.
Thank you. You mentioned in the beginning regarding the decline in interest for Czechia. I was wondering if that was the case for countries in general. For instance, if that is the case for bigger countries, which have a continuous impact on the world economy, or for developing countries, if the more a country develops, therefore the more stable it becomes, therefore the less interesting it becomes. And if, for instance, that is the case for outside of Europe, if it works the same?
I think so. I mean, I I'm not going to pretend to be any kind of expert in this area, but I am aware, both from being in a degree an insider working for the BBC, but also just being aware of the environment, that I think in general around the world, definitely in Britain, and one hears in America as well, in the English language media world, there is simply less interest in what is going on around the world. There's just less interest in foreign news. That's something that I always read, and I'm always told. Whether it's true, I don't know, but I imagine that it must, to a degree, be true, that people just don't care so much beyond Ukraine, Gaza, what is happening.
Any other questions? Well, this man in the front row, and then we'll come to you.
I'd like to circle back to the AI. So at this point, the BBC and Reuters are not using AI to actually write stories. You're using it yourselves to improve your own work product. But, reading American reporting, I see AI stories written all the time, especially in sports. You know, it's a lesser game. Some robot just goes in and looks at the box score and basically reports what guys scored, what was the halftime. I mean, it's really ridiculous reporting. And it also, you know, you see a lot of American reporting where reporters are just reporting on other reports. They're not even going out in the field and doing any investigating or fact-checking or anything like that. They're saying, well, the New York Times said this or the Washington Post said this, and so we're reporting what they've said. So, I mean, AI could do that just as easily as a human being could do that. But at this point, there's no AI really writing your stories.
There is. Not mine, but I mean, I know, we'll just say that there's a news service, as Daisy was saying, and as I said about when the BBC moved to shut down these 10 Hungarian service, Slovak service, Czech service, Albanian service, they closed them down, and they've mostly not come back, with the exception of something called BBC Polska. And I'm not quite sure what BBC Polska is, even though I've done a few things for them. I still don't know what it is, because I did it in English. I guess they must have voiced up me. But I do know that what they're doing is on a very, not a limited budget, but in a very limited fashion. They have Polish journalists based in London writing reports in Polish about the world and Poland, Polish politics and so on. They are using AI. I'm not sure exactly how, but I know that some of it is being written with AI. So some of the reporting is theirs, but a lot of it is being created with AI, not just by individual reporters as well, but on a more systematic basis. I don't know how it's done exactly, but BBC is using it.
Reuters isn't.
I think to a certain point they are. I'm not able to exactly say how because I'm not involved in it. I mean, the key thing is that it has to be declared. So if you see a story that was AI assisted, it will be written somewhere at the top of it. I haven't done anything like that, so I haven't really been interested in it so much. But to a certain point we do, and I'm sure there will be. We do a lot of stuff that is kind of low value added for some of our clients. You know, company files some report with the New York Stock Exchange or Czech Stock Exchange, and we would only grab the headline, company X has won a big contract to supply ABC, and it may be important for markets, but we don't really want to spend time on it. So I can imagine this is automated to some way already, or we have already been automating the publishing of economic data from statistical offices, where our robot reaches out to the website and grabs a headline, what inflation was last month in country X, and puts it out. And the human reporter only looks at it when the number is out, and then we decide whether it's worth doing a story or not. So this kind of stuff is already happening.
Thank you.
Can I jump in for 1 second? I just wanted to go back to the question about whether interest in foreign news is dwindling. Because I think it comes back around to another aspect of this conversation in an interesting and important way. So we know that public trust in journalism is dwindling. I think in the United States it's something like 23% of news readers have any confidence in the trustworthiness of the information they're consuming. Combine that with digital overwhelm, and I think that foreign news and even national news can be more than the ordinary news consumer can reasonably digest with any hope of agency. You can read bad news all day long. What can you do about it? Not much. And this is a period of time where I think that can create a lot of despair in news consumers. There's an antidote, however, and that is local news. I think that there is a real need for re-examining the importance of local news for local audiences. This is actually the model that RFE is built on. So we do Kyrgyz news for audiences in Kyrgyzstan, in Kyrgyz, etc. News from Belarus, in Belarus, for Belarusian audiences in the Belarusian language. We are not necessarily writing a great deal about international or global affairs, because we want to give those audiences the news they're not receiving, the news that they need to act on their own behalf for the benefit of themselves and their families. And that extends to communities everywhere. So I'm sorry that you feel like there's not a lot of demand for English language news for the international community in the Czech Republic. I'm sure you're probably right based on experience, but look, like 1 out of 10 people in the Czech Republic is a non-Czech. They're here either as a long-term foreign resident or transient passing through. Either way, they have real problems when it comes to integrating, when it comes to understanding the local culture, and increasingly, that's going to become important. There's a war in Ukraine that is spilling over into Europe, and if you think about something like the 72 Hours Initiative, which is calling on all citizens to, become prepared and have a go bag. I know that those are for natural disasters and things like that, but you want your foreign residents to be as equipped and as engaged in the local life of the country and the community that they live in as possible, so as not to be a drain on the society. And so I think that I'm always talking about local news and how important it is, but I really hope that it fuels a resurrection, or at least a resurrection of interest in this type of journalism where the audience really does have agency. They can actually really do something about the news they're consuming.
Great answer. On the issue of distrust, Rob, I'm curious, if you meet negativity, say if you go out on the street to do Vox Pops and you've got your BBC mic filter or whatever, do you get different reactions than in 1999?
I don't do Vox Pops anymore. And I lost my BBC mic shield, so I've got a normal black one. But yeah, no, I have noticed a few occasions. Obviously, I still, report and still go and cover stories. And when I do that, I do always try and speak not just to the main speakers and people that I have arranged to meet, but also what we are told and what I hate calling ordinary people. And occasionally, yes, I have come across occasional hostility when I've said BBC in the past few years in a way that was never the case before. So that has changed. But whether it's something that I was just lucky enough to not come across before, I don't know.
Another question, the man with the glasses here in the scarf. Yes, over here. Mike's just coming. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for everything. It's very interesting, and everything has been focused on not just today, but the past. If you imagine that, but in fact, in reality, we all live in the future. So if you were to imagine that you were sitting here in 5 years' time, what do you think the structure would be, and what would be the interests of the audiences that you would have in 5 years' time? I have two more things, but I'll leave that. Can I leave that as something for you to think about?
Well, Hansa?
I think in general, the trend has been, and I believe it will continue for us, is to deliver news that really is original and is different than anybody else could deliver. And I think it will be more focused on even more going out and talking to the local people and local sources. And with everything, with a lot of stuff being available for free instantly on the internet, this has been the focus for some years. But what I've seen is with Reuters, even more focus on exclusive reporting and talking to people that other people don't talk to, or getting exclusive information. And I think this is where the value is, because I think it will pretty much disappear everywhere else. Everything will be out there instantly everywhere. So there may be, we have already been writing fewer articles than in the past. We have fewer people. We outsource stuff to others, and we try to focus on stuff that matters. And I hope this remains in place. If it doesn't, then there's no future.
We can take one more question from you, sir. If you have another question, did you say? Sorry, I thought you said you had a couple of things. Well, we have time for one more.
That was only one answer from one gentleman, the ex-BBC man who... have you still...
Not ex yet. She's
not ex yet.
I apologize.
The way things are going, you know.
I apologise. I was wondering whether, in fact, you've still got the same boxes that you've had for 20 years that you were using. You said you were sitting next to your laptop with your boxers for 20 years. That's
boxers.
Boxer shorts.
Yeah, boxer shorts.
Yes, boxer shorts.
I have now got many new pairs of boxer shorts than 20 years ago. But yeah, no, I was sitting in my boxers. Rather.
I understand. I apologise. It was
I do have
supposed to be a bit of English fun. The lady here, I've lived here for 11 years, which is very small compared to most people here. But in that time, the level of both knowledge and use of English as a means of communication amongst Czech nationals and all the other people that I know, from Nepalese to Vietnamese who live here and so on, is actually grown. I actually believe that there is a huge market for English language, community-led, which is what I believe in. I don't care what's going on 50,000 miles away or anything. I don't care about it. What I care about is the community in which I live in and the people around me. Because I had breast cancer 3 years ago, and the people who are here, who are locally to me, those are the people that mattered to me going through that phase. And so, if I may say, I think there is a great market in Prague for English, some form of English-speaking, community-led media.
I couldn't agree more.
So, can we have the mic here in the second row, please? Sorry, mic in the second row, please, if that's possible.
But the question is, how do you fund that? That's the problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer to that question, which would be really convenient if I did. But there are new models of seeking sort of debt and equity funding for media projects. We have, look, we've got a Substack, we've got a podcast, we've got connections to Reuters. There are ways to pull community information together. I admit, I mean, after leaving RFE, I worked for, I helped start a local news initiative in a very rural community in the United States, and it is an uphill battle. No one has found the silver bullet for funding small initiatives. But if a sufficient number of community members deem it to be important, it can happen one way or another. A lot of news that is being produced right now in English in the Czech Republic is basically done on the back of the person who's producing it. So these are not, high-flying projects, but they're very worthy. I would just say very briefly, in addition to the various things I do, I help run a mentoring network for women living and working in Prague, and that includes Czechs and non-Czechs. And one of the things I hear most often among the non-Czechs is, I have no way to plug into this community. I want to do it desperately, and I don't know how to do it. So to me, that is human capital that is lost. And I hope you're doing better in terms of your cancer treatment.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry, okay, one more question from the audience. This is the last one. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't think about this before, but I would be remiss, I think we would all be remiss in this room, not to mention what Rob Cameron did during COVID in English. Excuse me, but I've forgotten the name of what you were calling your...
Help Your Hood.
Help Your Hood, exactly.
Community thing.
So it was in English on Facebook when all of us were scared, especially at the beginning. We didn't know what was going on. And it had a huge audience and a huge interest among all of the English speakers for sure, and maybe beyond that. But I don't know, maybe you want to say a few words about the response that you had to that initiative.
If I may, yeah, very briefly. I mean, thank you very much, Grant. It did have... you're right, a very big following, 5,000 members, I think, in the end. 5,000 people in the group. And it started very, very small and grew very quickly. And it did become something, that I think you are sort of imagining as a sort of community portal in English for people who were bewildered and curious and needed information in English, high quality, sourced, reliable information about what was happening in this country in the light of something that was obviously happening across the globe. But again, I will say just very briefly that, we're talking about why couldn't something like that work in non-COVID times, because, it goes to funding, and you need to find people who have the energy and the time to do this pretty much as their jobs. And that is something that you really can't do, as I found to my cost, as a hobby for more than, say, a year or 18 months.
Thanks, everybody. I have one final question. What advice would you guys give to a young person who said that they want to get into journalism? Hansa?
Apart from the obvious one, what I found myself was that you can start as a journalist in any field, and whatever field you get deeper into, you will find very exciting. So get your foot in somewhere, and it can be sports or culture or even business, which may sound dreadful to some people, like it did to me. But whatever field you get a little deeper into, it can become very, very exciting. So that's my advice.
Rob?
Everything that Hansa said, but also learn to be a plumber.
And Daisy?
Yeah, I can't improve upon that other than to say I would always say do it. Even if you only do it for a few years, it is such a fantastic profession because it teaches you how to interact with your community. It teaches you how to do research, to ferret out information, to communicate compellingly. All of those things will carry you far in whatever you invariably do next, because you're not earning any money doing journalism. So I would say that there is still a bright future for young people who are interested in journalism as part of a toolkit that will take them into the future.
And that's a very nice place to end. Thank you very much to all of you for coming, and thank you, of course, to our guests, Jan Lapatka, Rob Cameron, and Daisy Sindelar. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.